A vast majority of the Druze religion remains somewhat hidden. There is the idea that you, as a Druze, you can choose whether you are religious or secular. And if you're religious and you are accepted to be a religious scholar, you will learn the secrets of the Druze religion, and you will act differently, you will dress differently, you'll see the religious Druze in a very distinct way. The founder of the Druze religion was declared as an apostate by the Caliph, and therefore, after he was ordered killed, the Druze realized that they need to hide later, and that means that you can find Druze high officers in Israel, in the Israeli military, but you can also find Druze in Hezbollah, and you can also find Druze in the Asad military, infrastructure, and in that sense, that created some conflicts that I think were not always visible to the media, and that means that they're very much a part of the Israeli culture. In the day of
Yeah.
remembrance for soldiers, which is a very sober, solemn day in Israel, the Druze are very much a part of the Jewish community that is commemorating their victims and their fallen one, while the Arabs are not a part of that dynamic.
Welcome to Scholars Unravel the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. I was born in the Middle East, but grew up in America, and I have a message for Middle Eastern Americans. Don't learn about the Middle East from US news media or Hollywood, and don't buy into the Western view of world history. That's why I talk to scholars, 150 and counting, scholars who have spent decades studying the Middle East, scholars who make it easy for all of us to understand, because in this program, they distill their extensive research and rich stories into an hour of engaging conversation with me. And my goal for this program is to correct our misperceptions and misconceptions about the Middle East, this fascinating region with its long and remarkable history. Dr. Bombs, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. So let's get right into it. Who are the Druze?
Well, the Druze is a minority group. It's located mainly in the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. They emerged about 1,000 years ago,
Hmm.
broadly from Egypt, just like a number of other interesting minorities in the Middle East, like the Baha'is. They emerged from the Shia, but they established themselves as a separate group, an ethnic group, a religious group, although some would put them in the same basket as the Arabs. Most of the Druze would resent that and will tell you that I am a Druze. As a part of the religious theology of the Druze, which is connected to this, the vast majority of the Druze religion remains somewhat hidden. There is the idea that you, as a Druze, you can choose whether you are religious or secular. And if you're religious and you are accepted to be a religious scholar, you will learn the secrets of the Druze religion, and you will act differently, you will dress differently, you'll see the religious Druze in a very distinct way. And if you're secular, you remain secular, and you are much less exposed to a lot of it. And if you are Druze, you're a Druze. Your soul reincarnates at the end of your life into another Druze soul. The assimilation and the intermarriage rates among the Druze are low. Of course, there are cases like that, but they're overall low. The cohesion of the community is very large. And what I'm saying now is actually relevant to perhaps some of the other issues that we are about to discuss, and why the Druze conflict in Syria very quickly influenced a broader conflict and a response from the Druze in Israel. This community is very tight. The loyalty and the camaraderie and the responsibility of the Druze one to another is very significant, and they act as a close community in a sense that you cannot really be a member of this community. You cannot really convert to become a Druze. That process broadly does not exist. Of course, the Druze are very welcoming. There's not a problem to enter a Druze village. Actually, here in Israel, this is done very often. The Druze are very much integrated. They are very much also a part of the Israeli society, Israeli military, Israeli politics. There's been members of Knesset, even ministers who were Druze. In Lebanon and in Syria, in some ways, it's similar. You have very senior Druze politicians, very senior Druze public figures. And again, interestingly enough, and that's perhaps a part of a minority strategy broadly, you see integration and affiliation and loyalty to the government as an important principle. The Druze are also very loyal to their land. And therefore, because they consider themselves as the guardians of their land, so they usually have their own communities and their own areas, and they want to keep that. And in that sense, they also need to work with their governing structures. So in Israel, it's going to be the state of Israel. In Lebanon, it's going to be the state of Lebanon, and in Syria, it's going to be the state of Syria. And that means that you can find Druze high officers in Israel, in the Israeli military, but you can also find Druze in Hezbollah, and you can also find Druze in the Asad military, infrastructure, and in that sense, that created some conflicts that I think were not always visible to the media and to the broader discourse around some of the events that have just taken place in the past few weeks in Sweden.
You're referring to Israel attacking Syria to protect the Druze. That's the incident that you're referring to, right?
Well, that's a part of it, but I'm also referring to the Druze Israeli response to the events in Syria involving the Druze, and I'm referring to the leadership dimensions between the Druze communities. That has been a part, a very important component within these events. Certainly, one of the components explaining the Israeli response to this, which was influenced by the Israeli Druze community response to the events in Syria. And again, there may be some tension, I would say, between the interests of the Druze community in Israel and the interests of Israel, and that's part of the balancing act that it needs to be taken place here.
Let me go back and ask some questions, unpack some of the things that you said. Really interesting. You drew a parallel. Well, not parallel. You merely referenced Baha'i saying how they were an offshoot of Shiaism, and that happened 200-300 years ago. I think it was about 200 some years ago. Similarly, Druze sort of are an offshoot. That's my word, not your word. They sort of splintered off of Shiaism. So are they another sect of Shiaism? I asked that question because I've read that they also have elements of Christianity and Judaism, and one source was even saying Buddhism. So what does that make them?
It makes them Druze. And if you ask the Druze, who are they? They're not an offshoot of anyone. I mean, they obviously recognize the history, but they consider themselves Druze. They're not a sect. They're not a part of Shia. They are Druze. They are a distinct ethnic group and a distinct religious group. That's how they see themselves. Obviously, they have origins in the Middle East, but and part of that, Jethro, which is the father-in-law of Moses, is one of the most important prophets. So of course they have taken some ideas from different religions, but again, every religion is taking
Yep.
ideas that are seen in other religions.
So the
But
name of their religion is also Druze. There are Druze people, and their religion is also called Druze.
correct.
I see. Um, Several times you use this word, these two words, all interchangeably. Aspects of the religion is hidden, secret religion, this and that. What's up with all the secrecy? Uh, is that to is that because they were persecuted? Is that to ward off assimilation?
Well, uh, I believe that when you established a new religion in a place as volatile as the Middle East, you need to protect yourself in some form. Remember that if you're looking at the story of the Baha'is, which is of course different than the story of the Druze, when the Baha'u'llah that in Iran speaks about another prophet that is bigger than him, speaking about, sorry, when the Bab was speaking about the Baha'u'llah, he was immediately killed. And Baha'u'llah was immediately taken to prison and thrown in the dungeon of the empire. So if you are trying to be too visible about this and you're trying to speak about a new message from God, there's a good chance that somebody is going to call you a heretic, which is, by the way, part of what we have seen in the recent conflicts when Bedouin, Sunnis, Islamists came to attack Druze. Um, and so I think that some of the secrecy had to do with an attempt to defend the Druze community against others who otherwise would attack them, would call them heretics, and would threaten them. So I guess I believe that some of the secrecy comes from that dimension. And afterwards, it became part of a tradition. If you don't want to risk something, then don't share it with too many people. And the Druze decided that only a few people will learn the real history of the history and the legacy and the theology of the Druze religion. And in a way would make sure that they keep the tradition, but not make it too broad, really not to just to protect themselves.
So, were there incidents in history of severe and widespread persecution of the Druze?
Well, they were
I asked that question in particular, Dr. Bombs, because you informed me that they have been part of IDF, they have also been part of Hezbollah, and they have helped the Alawites, they have helped Syria. So it seems like there's an element of successful assimilation into the host countries that they're in, right? Hence one
so
reason why I asked that question. Yeah.
so listen, the Druze, as I said, was they started in Egypt under in the time of the Fatimids,
Yeah.
and they are already declared as heretics by the religious establishment. So the Al Hakim Al Amr Aliyah, who the ruling caliph, they declared they declared the Druze as heretics, and I think this was a major incentive for the Druze to hide their religion. So there were other cases in history where the Druze came under attack, which is partially why you will see them in sometimes more isolated communities, or in a place like the Druze Mountain. Why the Druze Mountain? Again, a place that is easier to defend. And this again, something that had became from the time of on the time of old, when there's some Druze leaders were, El Darazi was the Druze, the founder of the Druze religion, was declared as an apostate by the Caliph, and therefore, after he was ordered killed, the Druze realized that they need to hide. Later on, they became more accepted, and again, that's partially with the minority strategy, when they were able to show that they were able to bring some benefit for the state and be more recognized as a minority. They basically died in Egypt, but in the more isolated areas of Syria and Lebanon, they remain, and this is really explains why the Druze of today are concentrated in these areas.
I see. Did the Druze play any major role in Middle East history? For example, if you look at Kurds, they were part of different empires, militaries. They helped balance power between the Safavid and the Ottoman empires. This is before borders were settled clearly. Saladin came from a Kurdish family of Kurdish descent. So I'm just drawing a parallel. Did Druze also play throughout Middle East history an important role that we can point to and say, wow, these people or this group or this army was Druze?
The Druze were not like the Mamluks, where they all of a sudden created an empire from being slaves.
That's a great comparison. Yeah.
And they, broadly speaking, they're small and remain small. Over a million, some said 1.5 million, all throughout the world. And so when they were never attempted to create an empire, but they were very brave soldiers. By the way, one of the reasons why many of them are very brave fighters is because of this belief that your soul really never dies. So if you die, even in a battle, soon enough you will be reincarnated. When you actually have
Wow.
stories with the Druze, and some of this, if you want, you can even in a way Google it or YouTube it up, and you will see some stories of Druze children, young children, who would speak about where they used to live, and they would go to a house and says, "This is where I was," and they have actually some of them vivid memories of their time of their past life. That's a
Wow.
big thing amongst the Druze. The Druze were known to be brave soldiers. They actually, we talked about the Mamluks, they were not leading this, but there actually were soldiers assisting the Mamluks and the Ayyubids before them. And later on, in the almost 500 years reign of the Ottoman Empire, they enjoyed the policy of the Ottomans that recognize minorities, and they enjoyed a degree of autonomy, which enabled them to establish their communities and develop them. There were a number of famous, more famous Druze. Fakir ad-Din, the second in the 17th century, was one of them. Of course, Sultan Anatrash was another. And Fakir ad-Din was a Lebanese ruler that was able to unite the Druze and the Maronite districts of the Lebanon mountains, and he's considered to be the father of modern Lebanon, and he had an important influence when it comes to the Druze in creating the districts that eventually became part of the Druze. But overall, the Druze were more interested in their own community rather than in conquering the Middle East.
Yeah, they never became a sort of a hegemonic power or power grabbing to establish polities and incorporate others. So one of the Druze is known as the father of modern Lebanon, which leads me to believe that they actually had played major roles at some points in Middle East history. Where the Druze, did they lose their villages in the whole since 1948 to now? Um,
Broadly, they have not lost their villages. And actually, when you're looking at the Golan Heights,
mhm,
that was taken from Syria in 1967, the vast majority of Syrians left. The vast majority of Druze stayed. So, broadly speaking, the Druze have not left. There's been some issues and differences between the Druze of the Golan Heights and the Druze of quote unquote pre-67 or 48
mhm.
Israel. There's some dynamics in that are different between their relations to Israel. Um, They've kept the Druze of the Golan Heights, who were basically Syrian citizens, have kept a bit of a different line. And that also began to change more recently. But they are actually the ones who did not move. And this is why we have a Druze, a number of, four Druze villages in the Golan Heights. By the way, we also have an interesting Alawite village, also in the edge
Oh,
of the Golan Heights with the border of Lebanon, a village called Rajab.
I see. Um, Aside from the Golan Heights, do Druze live in specific geographical locations in Israel, or are they sort of spread around?
No, they live in a number of villages. There are two big villages now, towns around Haifa called Darat al Carmel or Sofia, and then they live in the Galilee. There's one of the more famous ones called Julis, where it's the headquarter also of the religious a lot of the religious establishment and Sheikh Muwaffaq Tarif. So they live mostly Haifa and up north in the Galilee.
Um, I want to ask you, this is a non sequitur. I apologize for this, but I just thought of this very important question as you were talking about persecution and other issues that Druze had. This is something that you often see or hear about in the Middle East. Um, Throughout the span of their history, Druze have been minorities, as you shared with us. For example, under the Ottomans and others. Was there ever a scenario in, let's say, the 1800s or early 1800s that Druze saw it more prudent to have closer relationships, let's say, with other powers like European powers to balance that out against their host countries?
Well, in 1925, a Druze leader by the name of Sultan al-Atrash
Mhm.
led a revolt against the French rule,
Oh,
and he had some
this
success.
is the opposite of what I was just asking. This is wonderful. Okay, yeah.
He actually had some success. The and The rebellion spread actually throughout the region, came all the way through Damascus. Eventually, it was suppressed in 1927, if I'm not mistaken. And it's remembered as one of the first national uprisings in Syria. Uh, there was another short-lived episode where there was the sort of independent kind of autonomy for the Druze, and and actually these dynamics are very related to the other things we are probably about to discuss. So the Druze, for example, were active in Syria with the uprising and that led to one of the revolutions in 1954. The son of Sultan El-Atrash was one of the founders of the Ba'ath Party. Now, again,
Hmm.
let's speak
Hmm.
a little bit about that.
Yeah.
He was active in Syria. He was a speaker of the parliament, and eventually he came out of favor. As this was a period of many. There was like nine different revolutions and coups, really, in the first 10 years of Syria's existence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but to some degree, if you're looking at the logic of this, right, the Ba'ath brings a degree of equality to all, and that might have been a good minority strategy. They've gotten along fairly well with the Asads because the Alawites were a minority, the Druze were a minority, and the minorities needed each other. And this is why the Druze in Syria were relatively quiet and stable, and they actually had pretty good relations with the ruling state, partially again because of this minority dynamic and the configuration. And of course, after the Syrian revolution and the rise of Ahmed Shara, a Sunni leader, all of this became much more fragile. And that is a big part of the context of the what had happened just in the past few weeks, really, in the second week of July.
So let's talk about that. So Druze and Alawites, they're both minorities, and they've learned to get along to survive among a much larger Sunni uh, population. What happens after Bashar al-Assad is gone? Uh,
Well,
are the Druze suddenly persecuted? Is all of them, or is different factions of Druze have different relationships with this current government?
so broadly speaking, the Druze, partially because of their geographic location, the vast majority of them are concentrated in Jabal Druze in the area of Sweda. And Jabal, the word for mountain in Arabic, also means that they are, as other Druze mountains, located in a semi-isolated areas that are easier to protect. Again, a minority strategy. Um,
Is this in southwest Syria?
it's in the south part of Syria, east of the Israeli border,
Hmm.
about 85 kilometers from the Golan Heights. Um, and the uh, broadly speaking, the Druze have attempted to create relative neutrality in the time of the war. This is also requires a bit of a zooming in. The Druze are not made of one faction, and there were some struggles between the leaders at the time where the Syrian revolution had happened. The Druze, broadly speaking, had preferred to stay outside of this. At the time, the Syria war was a sectarian, ethnic, and more so proxy war.
Hmm.
The Druze certainly do not wish to be a part of that war or be and try to be careful of taking sides. But even that was not completely accurate or possible because there were senior Druze leaders and officers in the Syrian military. Um, some figures like Issam Zahraddin, a very well-known Syrian general, was a symbol of Assad, and he was operating, from the Druze mountain, and some of the advantage of the Druze being a very tight minority and having people, certainly in Lebanon, in other parts in the region, was that they were able to create networks that are very good for trade, but also very good for other things like smuggling. So,
Yeah.
as I've said, the Druze were very loyal to their governments and they were loyal to Syria. So they were in the time of the war, they were um, beginning, they were very much loyal to Assad. Then there were some Druze like Sheikh Bal'aous who wanted to push for more naturality, and those who have pushed to be more, to continue their alliance of old with the government in order to have the government perhaps, help defend them. There are many actually at that period who came to the Druze area because it was considered one of the quieter areas. Uh,
Hmm.
Sweda was not significantly attacked or bombed like so many other Syrian cities.
During the
Because
civil war
again,
that was going on, right?
because the Druze, broadly speaking, I think it was a good strategy for them to keep themselves a little bit below the fold and below the storm. It became much more complicated after Assad was basically gone, and now this entire minority structure of Syria and some of this alliance is gone, and the new team led by Ahmed al-Shara and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which some of it is not just Sunni Muslim, but also Islamists and a fairly conservative of some jihadi background. We've seen some of this, some of these militias that came to Idlib, which were the more radical militias that came to one area and eventually there formed a larger militia, a military,
Yeah.
and then went to occupy
Damascus.
take over Damascus,
Yeah.
where now the bulk of the Syrian military or the Syrian security structure. It's not yet structured, but at least it's there, at least tacitly, and we've seen this conflict because you've seen these movies of these militias who are coming out in vehicles and in uniform related to the Syrian Ministry of Defense or the Syrian military or the Syrian security, but they're coming to the Druze village and they're calling Allah Akbar, God is great, you're heretics, and then they humiliate the Druze. And we've seen these pictures of sheikhs, the religious leaders, and part of what they're known for in the terms of how they're dressed. They have special hats, they have special clothes, and they have uh, distinct, mustache and sometimes beards, but they're very distinct mustache, and you'll see them being their mustaches were shaved. There were many other things that have done there even more graphic than that because we've seen really mutilation of bodies and rape of
Wow.
women. So there was a lot on that, and this is something that the Druze have not experienced before. And that was a big part, and we can get into that of what actually happened on the from the 13th of July.
So when this new government, perhaps not the entire government, but jihadists or fundamentalists, radical Islamists within this new coalition that forms this government uh, uh, began attacking and persecuting the Druze in the south region of Syria. At some point, Israel gets involved with that. What happens? What's the reason for that?
So the reason does not really start with the Druze.
Hmm.
Uh, Syria in December very quickly, really in 11 days since the beginning of the military campaign that started in Idlib. Everything happens very quickly, actually, with not very many bullets. And 11 days later, Assad is gone out of Damascus, if I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
mistaken, on December 8th. And we have a new president of Syria, which was really the leader of Idlib, a former member of Al Qaeda, and then Jabhat al-Nusra, and then Fatah al-Sham, and then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, all Islamist organizations. But it's important to look a little bit at the chronology of this because it means something about the still contested personality of Muhammad al-Julani, as he was nom de guerre, as a Islamist leader, and then Ahmed Ashara, which is really his real name. Ashara is a well-known
And
filmmaker
before
in
he
Syria.
was affiliated, I think, with Al Qaeda or something like that, and then he sort of rebranded himself. He let go of his nom de guerre and then picked up his own name, and we have him now. And he just recently met with President Trump in Saudi Arabia, right?
All correct. I mentioned that they
Yeah.
started from Al Qaeda, and then, but part of this, and he was also arrested by the Americans at the very beginning of it. He was a military commander. He was familiar to Israel because he was actually operating in the south. The name Jolani comes from Jolan. That's where his origins of his family. But he was actually born in Saudi Arabia. And his father, a very well-known communist writer, and comes also from the Ashara family. His great
Mhm.
uncle was the foreign minister of Syria, Farouk Ashara. And that means that his roots are not jihadi. His
Interesting.
roots are actually he grew up in one of the most affluent suburbs of Damascus. He became radicalized a little later, and in his course he had moved, rebranded, as you said, from Al Qaeda, but he also attempted to create a distinct identity and within the broader contour of the different jihadists, he attempted to take a line that I would say was slightly less radical than some of the other radicals, but still within the very hardcore Islamists. There are certainly other people around him um, who are more extreme than him, and this has been part of the trajectory of events and the dilemmas of how a jihadi with a suit now meets not only President Trump but also is accepted by the president of France and in Saudi Arabia and the United
Yeah,
Arab Emirates.
yeah.
Um,
So
but
how does this background relate to the Druze?
well, in the following way.
Hmm.
The when Ashara comes to Syria as a new president, Israel, of course, treats us with a mixed bag of suspicion, but also in some ways satisfaction. The satisfaction comes part not necessarily from Ashara. Again, Israel did not elect him to become the president of Syria, or nominated a person with this type of CV or a resume. We would have
Yeah,
rather to see, I would say a more Mahatma Gandhi
yeah.
type of person if we could choose. But the issues that we've had with Syria actually were less with the Syrians. They were more to do with what happened with the non-Syrians. This war brought
Hmm.
Hezbollah, this war brought Iranian bases. Syria has been one of the uh, very active fronts of the following October 7 war. Syria has been the most important um, link for weapons coming to Hezbollah. There were bases in Syria that were only Iranian bases, also Russians.
Hmm.
Eventually, the fall of Assad and the rise of Ashara has to do with some of this. Israel had managed a fairly effective campaign in Syria, also in Lebanon, to weaken the Iranian presence and contingent within Syria. The Russians had other priorities within the past few years, mainly related to the war in Ukraine. The Russians and the Iranians were the main forces that held Assad in power. And the Syrian military, that was really deteriorated and got weakened in the time of the war, um, had very little motivation to assist this effort. And part of what had happened with the time of the war is that there were not so many bullets were shot because the military did not object. Ahmed Ashara comes and speak about his vision of a
You
new
mean in
Syria.
part of the war? Are you talking about the 11 days in which Damascus
Yeah,
essentially
correct.
fell? The military didn't put up a resistance.
Yes.
Okay,
Ahmed
okay, I'm
Ashara,
following.
Ahmed Ashara speaks about his vision of the new Syria. That vision appears appealing to many in the West, and not just, mainly because he actually, irrespective of his background, and perhaps related to the change in his look, attire, suit, beard, um, he speaks about power sharing. He speaks about Syria that will preserve the rights of women, the rights of minorities, a new constitution. Okay, it's going to take 5 years. He speaks about elections and structures, and Israel is
This
looking at.
this sounds good, doesn't it? I mean, on paper, what he's saying is sounds good, right?
Well, in theory, there is not much difference between theory and practice, but in practice, often there is. When Israel is looking at this, Israel is saying two things. One, like, look, we're happy that the Iranians are gone. I mean, this has been really the bulk of our problem with Syria. Um, on the other hand, we're not yet sure if this is the end of the game. Syria have seen its own fair share of revolutions and rebellions. At the peak of the war, the people estimated that there were about 1,000 armed militias. Some of them, by the way, are Druze and different ones, as we've seen in the recent few days. And so it will take a while to turn all of this into really a functioning state. Israel said the following in the very early days when it comes to the new president of Syria. After we are happy that the fact that the Iranians are gone, there was an approach that was divided into two. On the one hand, Israel said, listen, we're not yet sure who you are. We're not going to believe all the statements that you say or going to trust this. That's not something that we would do. Certainly not after 2 years almost of war after October 7th. We're going to give it some time. So on the one hand, there was an attempt to engage and eventually create channels, and I've been actually involved in at least some of this work. Israel have known Syrians for quite some time because of the humanitarian work that we've done in the time of the war. And some of these engagement channels reached all the way to the Syrian president, and there were actually direct negotiations taking place actually at the same day in Azerbaijan between Israelis and Syrians, and meetings at a fairly high level. But Israel said at the same time, look, we are going to speak with you. We're going to see if you can come to terms. In the Israeli headlines, they were even speaking about normalization, but really that was not so much on the agenda. What was on the agenda is an attempt to recalibrate security arrangements. Israel have taken as a precaution a number of positions. Israel had bombed a big part of the remaining Syrian military, something that was actually accepted by many of the Syrians because they says, listen, the military was used to attack us, so okay, it's fine that Israel will take it down. And Israel taken positions within the demilitarized zone, and have taken positions in the south on Syrian territory, something that upset the Syrians a bit. But Israel had done that and said, listen, we're going to do that because we want to make sure that there's not going to be additional militias, weapons coming close to the Israeli border. And this is a condition. Israel asked for a demilitarized Syrian south of Damascus. And perhaps in a convenient way, the range that was set up for the south of Syria was included the majority of the Druze villages. So everything south of Damascus is actually where the Druze live. And Israel said that we don't want to have heavy weapons. That's an important part because at the time when it all started, we actually are seeing tanks going to the south, something that was broadly speaking against the understandings between Israel and Syria. Of course, Syria has the right to bring tanks, but Israel said that we're not going to allow it, and that was a part of it. And so, if you will, what happened here was two things in parallel. Israel said, we don't want to see weapons coming toward us. We don't like the idea of this jihadi militias. Broadly speaking, we don't like them. We certainly don't like to see them next to our borders. We also Israel also communicated the issue of minorities, because there were some statements that said that Israel sees the Druze and also the Kurds as allies, broadly speaking, within the kaleidoscope of the Syrian state, and there is some commitment to this. And therefore, if you juxtapose the issues of weapons coming through, militias coming through, and they are attacking the Druze close to the Israeli border, that was in some ways sort of the red line that Israel had marked. Of course, this is not unrelated to the Druze community in Israel that very quickly demanded and actually closed junctions and said that Israel needs to respond. They did more than that. 1,000 of them, a couple of days later, actually crossing the border. Some of them were trying to actually join the fight. This has been by itself a very rare and not an easy event that links some of the dots here.
You mean like the Druze community within Israel lobbying the Israeli government to do something to help the Druze in Syria? Is that?
Yes, but as I said, they did more than that. They actually took weapons and crossed the border.
They went into yeah.
And the majority of them were eventually stopped, partially by the positions of the IDF inside Syria. So they were able to actually cross the border and go inside Syria. Some of them had reached. There was another small enclave of Druze in the Golan Heights on the Syrian side, very close to the village of Majd al-Shams, a village called Hadar. So they were able to reach there, and some of them were able to reach beyond. But I'm trying to give the broader picture. In where Israel said we would like to see demilitarization, that's a part of it, and that's a part of trust-building measures. We can speak soon enough about what else Israel did, because Israel responded, some would say, in a more forceful way than should, partially by bombing in Damascus itself, including the Syrian Ministry of Defense. And that was sort of beyond the area of Sweda. But that was a part of Israel's message beforehand. Mr. Ashara, you are responsible to make sure that this is not going to happen next to our border. And I would put another side comment on this issue that we've discussed before of between theory and practice. I think Mr. President Ashara's vision, of course, is the right vision, not only because it sounds good, it's also because if you believe in Syria and you understand Syria, it's probably, broadly speaking, the only vision possible. And by this, I mean the following. Syria now, again, recovers from really 14 years of war. A third of its population became refugees outside of Syria. Another third of its population became displaced within the state. Most opposition figures speak about close to 1 million people who lost their lives. So a lot had happened in Syria. If you want to keep Syria as one cohesion state, after all this sectarianism, sectarian ethnic proxy war, with militias, fighting each other, you need to find a formula for both power sharing on the one hand, and on the other hand, security and state that will be able to take control. So the notion that we don't want militias on the one hand is important, and on the other hand, the notion of power sharing is also important. So that means that Ashara is saying, I want to make sure that I have one army. It's called the Syrian army. I don't want Lebanon. I don't want Hezbollah, and I think many of us would support it. And therefore, I don't want militias. I don't want Druze militias, Kurdish militias, Alawites militias. I want one military. And this is a big part of my challenge.
An organized military that's under the direct command of the government versus just a bunch of militias running around and doing things on their own and causing trouble.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
However, doing that takes probably more than a day, and it requires also a lot of discipline. Their track record coming to these events in July is far from perfect, because we have seen events in March in the coast with the Alawites, where we have seen also something that was described as a massacre against the Alawites, and we've seen another small incursion that also ended up with what 110 dead in April. Druze from Jaramana and Sahniya in suburbs of Damascus, and that's an area that is less protected. And part of that comes following a deal, an agreement made in April, in where the Druze are going to give their weapons, or some of their heavy weapons, to the government, and the government will protect them. And now, after this had happened, and the government was not able to protect them, some of the Druze are saying, listen, we cannot give the government our weapons, and we have to protect ourselves because we cannot trust the government. The events in Sweden begins within this context. There is a broader move to create one military, one security force, one police, making sure that militias are not going to call the shots and that we're not going to have a Hezbollah type of a scenario. However, how do I enforce that? I can either negotiate or I can either take it by force. And what happens later is that these dynamics are a part of the conflagration of what is about to happen. Because what began as a local event in Sweden and really a conflict between Bedouin and Druze, both, by the way, involved in things that are related to smuggling routes and otherwise, I would put it broadly speaking, some militia work, became a much more complicated issue because of these dynamics. Now, the effort to clear the militias is something that is important not just for President Ashara. It's also important for Israel. We would like to see less militias in the region, and especially if we can guarantee a degree of power sharing. If Syria is able to create peace within its own communities and create power sharing and create and cater to the interests of the different communities, and make sure that secular and religious and Islamists and Druze and Alawites and Christians and Kurds can find a way to live together, Syria is probably going to be more peaceful inside, and then it's going to be a better neighbor for Israel. So broadly speaking, we have an interest for this to succeed. The problem starts when these dynamics do not seem to initially be successful, as we have seen with some of these massacres. And here it's also getting a bit more complicated, because it should not be described as a decision by Ashara to send militias wearing uniform to just massacre the Druze. The dynamics on the ground were slightly more complicated, and they had to do with some local dynamics that escalated, partially because all the parties had contributed something to it. When the initial event starts, when Bedouins are kidnapping a Druze, torturing him almost to death, the Druze are coming back to revenge. And that begins a local clash that begins to escalate. The Druze are asking the government, well, we need some security here. It's getting out of hand. The government brings a convoy of a security force to basically, from the Ministry of Defense, to basically help create order. That's where some of the issue begins, because they move this convoy, comes with trucks that seems very similar to what we've seen with some of the Al-Qaeda clips, with military that is really made of former militia people who are not entirely trained and not entirely creating order, but are beginning to create some havoc around some Druze villages, in one specifically at Mazara outside of Sweda. And so all of a sudden, the Druze are seeing that rather the government is really not trying to uh, make order, but rather they're attacking the Druze. A Druze faction is ambushing this convoy and kills this entire convoy, and then put some movies where
Oh,
they're literally dancing on their bodies. That spreads out, and now it becomes something that the previous 15 years, the Druze were able to mostly avoid. Now it's become sectarian. Now the Druze were killing the government forces, but really the Bedouin or the militias or the Sunnis. And now the Sunnis needs to come and protect their honor. And then we are seeing some of the more difficult pictures, and they're really horrible, including people who are, shot, they're forced to jump off their houses, difficult acts against
and
women, the shaving of the mustaches, and all of that.
and this is all happening relatively close to Israel's border. Um, I see. Let's take a break here. In the next segment, I'm going to talk with Dr. Bombs about Druze in Israel. We'll be right back. Dr. Bombs, in the last segment, we talked about the origin of the Druze and how they have been involved in different revolutions and with different empires and dynasties. And then we continued that on to something that's very important and has happened recently, the conflict that occurred in Syria and Israel's involvement and attack. What I want to know is, have the Druze been embroiled in sectarian fighting in Lebanon? And I know they had a civil war going on for almost 30 years. Have there been a big player, or have they similarly tried to stay neutral, like not side with the Hezbollah, not side with the PLO and all of that?
Well, the Druze community in Lebanon, as I've discussed before, had a role in the formation of the modern state.
Yeah.
And since they wanted to be also a part of the community and a part of the Lebanese political scene, the Druze were broadly in favor of pan-Arabism, and in that sense also the Palestinian cause. When you think about this, it also makes some sense. Pan-Arabism, similar to Baathism in a different way, tries
Mm-hmm.
to eliminate the differences between minorities and ethnic groups so they can be treated as equal. When that's why the Alawites have also liked the Ba'ath. If you are a minority and you're speaking Arabic, and I can be equal to the Sunni majority, that's probably a good ideology for me to support.
Yeah.
Arabism came along with the Palestinian cause. So, since many of them were a part of the socialist parties, and the Progressive Socialist Party was actually founded by Kamal Jumbalat, a Druze leader, and they actually were fighting along with socialists and Palestinians against the Lebanese front that was mostly Christian, and then
Mm-hmm.
afterwards aligned with Israel. Kamal Jumbalat was assassinated in a speech in 1977. His son, Walid Jumbalat, took the leadership, and he played a very important role in keeping his father's legacy. Um, and so the Druze in Lebanon and the Druze in Israel and the Druze in Syria actually share different perspectives and ideas. And that's also looks into this leadership of the Druze and who is the most prominent Druze leader. In Syria as well, there are some differences between the Druze leadership that seeks to be more neutral and the Druze leadership that very much supported the government. Overall, a part of the minority strategy is to defend themselves by looking for the coverage of the state. And if the state takes a certain direction, sometimes the minority will follow suit. And this is why the part of the reputation of the Druze was that they're very loyal to wherever they are, partially to protect their life and community and land. And if the Druze in Israel who serve in the IDF and are IDF officers and are very proud Israeli Zionists are a part of the formation, the structure of the state of Israel, that was also the case in Lebanon, and therefore also with supporting pan-Arabism and the PLO. And in many ways in Syria, although the dynamics there, as we discussed, were a little different because Syria was ruled by a minority government, which made it easier for either minorities to work together and for the Druze to have relative more power because there were another minority in a formation rather than a small minority. And there were only about 300,000 Druze in Lebanon in the midst of a much larger sea of sects. And in that sense, an Arab Sunni majority of the time.
So you mentioned something that's interesting to me. You said loyalty to where they are, and you also mentioned Zionism. As I was preparing for my conversation with you, I came across something that was really interesting to me, and that is Druze Zionist movement. What is this about? When did this start?
I think it started very early on, while the Druze realized that the Zionists are winning. And as a part of that, they realized that there's going to be a new guardian and a master to the land. And they had pledged allegiance very early on.
You mean this is early on after 1948, or before?
Correct.
Okay, yeah.
And some of that had happened before 1948. Some of the relationship between Druze and Jews. But the Druze are actually very proud. Unlike the Arabs, the Druze serve in the Israeli IDF. The Arabs do not. The Druze have paid a very heavy price, and because of their being soldiers, and of course, some of them have lost their lives, and that means that they're very much a part of the Israeli culture. In the day of remembrance for soldiers, which is a very sober, solemn day in Israel, the Druze are very much a part of the Jewish community that is commemorating their victims and their fallen one. While the Arabs are not a part of that dynamic, that's connected to the Palestinian Israeli Arabs who look at the 1948 when this is the Israeli independence and the Palestinian Nakba. So very different dynamic when it comes to these minorities. And another, by the way, separating line between the Arabs and the Druze.
For my own edification, are Israeli Arabs, are Israeli Arabs allowed to serve in the IDF and choose
Israelis, Arab are allowed to serve in the IDF, and some of them do. The vast majority do not. They need to seek to do that. And we have a number of interesting voices, Arabs who are in the IDF, Muslims, Arab who are in the IDF, and Christian Arabs in the IDF. The number is relatively small. They're the ones who decided that they are going to sort of pledge allegiance to the majority, and also perhaps as a protest against their own conservative trends in the community, and thought that this, the IDF is also a vehicle for further
integration into society.
Yeah, so there are some people who have done that, but the numbers the numbers are very small.
How does that work? I know this is a bit of a digression, but I think it's really fascinating. How does that work out for the Arab Israelis to be part of a country when everybody is serving in the military, for them not to serve in the military. It's one thing if you're in America where a lot of people don't serve in the military, it's completely voluntary. But when in a country like Israel, where everybody's virtually in the military and as a group, you don't, as a group, generally serve, doesn't that right there create a separation? I'm not taking sides. I'm not, it's not a criticism. I'm literally wondering, this sets them apart, right? You and I, I'm not Arab. Let's say for arguendo, I'm Arab and you're Jewish Israeli. I'm Arab Israeli, you're Jewish Israeli. We grow up together, then we're 18, you go serve in the military, and I don't. That sort of creates a little bit of separation, doesn't it, in
That
society?
that is true, but I would say that perhaps unfortunately, or perhaps this is just a part of how life works here. The separation is actually even broader than that because
Hmm.
the Arabs and Jews broadly don't live in the same communities and broadly do not go to the same schools. There is a
Hmm.
minority that ended up sharing the same schools, mainly Arabs who go to Jewish schools, sometimes because they're again a better jump start for integration and for universities. Um, but that separation begins early, and part of that is language and culture and
Hmm.
religion and also affinity. Remember that the Arab Israelis, who sometimes call themselves Arab Palestinian Israelis or Palestinians or Arab Israelis, depending on how they're looking at this interesting triangle of identities, sometimes pledged some of their allegiance rather than to the Israeli state, but to the Palestinian cause. And in times of tensions, the two communities are witnessing this. Again, there are significant family ties, just like the Druze have family ties
Yeah.
to their brethren in mainly here in Syria, and then some in Lebanon. There are also family ties between the Arab Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank. And that's not sort of the case with the Druze, sorry, with the Jews. So the Druze have casted their lot with Israel very quickly also with the understanding that this is a way to create a destiny and alliance, and they speak about and we Israelis also speak about really a shared destiny. Um, the Druze are not only done that, they're also considered as such. So the Druze villages are amongst the places that many Israeli Jews would find it very comfortable visiting. And on weekends, you will see droves of Israelis going to Druze markets, going to Druze restaurants, going to Druze, vacation and homes, and to spend the weekend. And that's partially because they are so integrated in the society. On the other hand, in some Arab villages, there are only few that many Israelis would feel comfortable, walking and spending leisure time with. Again, Israel has other minorities. There are some Christian villages, Circassian villages. The vast majority of them are uh, have chosen a similar strategy. But the Arab Israelis at large, again, it's a large segment of the population, close to 20% of Israel's population. Uh, so it's different in the cities and in some of the villages, or in some of the villages in the area of the Triangle, which is closer to the West Bank. But broadly speaking, the dynamic is different because
Hmm.
again, the educational systems are different. A lot of the communities and where people live is a bit different.
So I think you said this. I'm just going to ask it again to make sure I understand it. Uh, do Druze members of the Druze community also, are they also in the Knesset? Do they have representation? And
Correct. Yeah, but not as a Druze party. They are Druze members in the Likud. which is again conservative, sort of from the right. You actually had Druze members in a number of other parties as well, but the Druze said that we want to have influence in the country, not as a separate minority party, but as being a part of
Just
the
as Israeli.
Justice Israeli. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's in elite institutions in Israel and elite universities. Do you see Druze? I mean,
Yes,
they're
absolutely.
yeah, proportion to their small numbers.
Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. If you wanted our audience to just remember one point about the Druze after everything we talked about, Dr. Bombs, what would that one point be?
Well, the Druze are unique. They're wonderful people. They're very brave people, and they're an integral part of the Middle East. But just like any other group, they're not of one brand, not of one color. We have to remember when it comes to Druze, also when it comes to Jews, or when it comes to Arabs, they're not necessarily all unified. And the Druze communities are diverse amongst themselves. They share an important cohesion and religion, but politically, they've had their own share of fighting, and we have seen even recently that the one Druze militia was really fighting another, and even assassinated other Druze leaders because of the political differences. And in
Hmm.
that sense as well, perhaps unfortunately, the Druze are very much a part of the Middle East.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Bombs. This was wonderful. I appreciate it. We had a broad ranging discussion. I look forward to having you in my program again.
Thank you very much.